In the summer of 2012, a courtroom in California became the center of a battle that was reshaping the modern world. On one side stood Apple, the company that had reinvented the smartphone. On the other stood Samsung, the technology giant that had risen from partner to rival. Lawyers argued over patents, designs, and intellectual property. But beneath the legal language was something much bigger. This was not simply a dispute over who invented a feature or who copied a product. It was a fight over the future of an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. By then, millions of people carried smartphones in their pockets. Most had no idea that two corporations were locked in a conflict stretching across continents, involving dozens of lawsuits, billions in damages, and some of the most important technological innovations of the century. Every device sold, every software update released, and every product launch became another move in a war that neither side could afford to lose.
What made the conflict so unusual was that Apple and Samsung were never supposed to become enemies. For years, the two companies depended on each other. Samsung manufactured critical components used inside Apple's products. Apple was one of Samsung's biggest customers. Their relationship generated enormous profits for both sides. Yet behind the scenes, a dangerous reality was beginning to emerge. The smartphone market was expanding at a pace few had predicted, and whoever controlled it would gain unprecedented influence over the future of consumer technology. Then, everything changed. A single product transformed the expectations of an entire industry. Companies that had dominated mobile phones for years suddenly found themselves struggling to keep up. Old business models collapsed. New opportunities appeared almost overnight. As consumers rushed toward a new vision of what a phone could be, Apple moved aggressively to protect its position.
Samsung moved just as aggressively to challenge it. What followed was more than a competition between products, it became a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to technology. One company focused on tight control, premium design, and a carefully managed ecosystem. The other pursued scale, speed, and relentless expansion across every segment of the market. Each strategy proved powerful. Each company accumulated enormous victories, and each became convinced that the other represented the greatest threat to its future. The consequences reached far beyond Silicon Valley and South Korea. The outcome would influence how smartphones were designed, how software ecosystems evolved, how consumers interacted with technology, and how the global tech industry would operate for decades to come. The question was no longer whether Apple and Samsung could coexist. The question was, which company would define the smartphone era?
To understand how this conflict became so important,
It is necessary to go back to a time when neither Apple nor Samsung controlled the smartphone market. In fact, the industry looked completely different. The companies that appeared untouchable were not based in California or Seoul. They were names like Nokia, BlackBerry, and Motorola. Their devices dominated store shelves, corporate offices, and consumer pockets across the world. Success was measured by battery life, keyboard design, network coverage, and manufacturing efficiency. Mobile phones were becoming increasingly popular, but most people still viewed them as communication tools rather than portable computers. The market itself seemed stable. Industry leaders had spent years refining products that consumers already understood. Physical keyboards were considered essential. Mobile internet was slow and often frustrating. Software was important, but it was not yet the center of the user experience. Most companies focused on hardware improvements rather than creating entirely new ways for people to interact with technology. Apple existed on the edge of this world. The company had already transformed several industries. The Macintosh had established Apple's reputation for design. The iPod had changed digital music. Yet despite these successes, Apple remained a relatively small player compared to the largest technology manufacturers. Its products inspired loyalty, but its influence was limited by market share. The company needed something bigger than a computer or a music player. It needed a product that people would use every day, everywhere they went. Meanwhile, Samsung occupied a very different position. Unlike Apple, Samsung was not built around a single product category. It was a vast industrial powerhouse. The company manufactured televisions, appliances, semiconductors, displays, and countless electronic components. Its strength came from scale.
Samsung could design, produce, and distribute products at a level few competitors could match. It was already one of the most important suppliers in the technology world, even if many consumers paid more attention to the brands using its components than to Samsung itself. This difference would later become one of the defining characteristics of the rivalry. Apple excelled at creating products people desired. Samsung excelled at building the infrastructure that made modern electronics possible. At the same time, a larger shift was beginning to unfold across the technology industry. Internet access was becoming faster. Wireless networks were improving. Digital services were expanding beyond desktop computers. Consumers increasingly wanted constant access to information, entertainment, and communication. The phone was evolving from a simple device into something far more important. The opportunity was enormous. Whoever could successfully merge computing, communication, software, and design into a single device would gain access to one of the largest consumer markets in history. Yet most established companies underestimated how quickly consumer expectations were about to change. They continued refining existing products while the foundation beneath the industry was shifting. Apple recognized the opening. The company saw that the future was not about making a better phone, it was about redefining what a phone could be. Instead of treating software as a secondary feature, Apple placed it at the center of the experience. Instead of designing around limitations that consumers had accepted for years, it questioned whether those limitations needed to exist at all. Samsung saw the same market forces, but from a different perspective. Its leadership understood that mobile devices were becoming the next major battlefield in consumer electronics. As demand for advanced phones increased, Samsung possessed something few competitors could match: manufacturing power, global reach, and the ability to move quickly when opportunities emerged. Neither company knew exactly how the coming decade would unfold, but both understood one critical fact: the mobile phone industry was approaching a turning point, and whoever adapted fastest would have a chance to shape the future of technology itself. The stage was set for a transformation that would disrupt entire corporations, create new empires, and eventually place Apple and Samsung on a collision course that neither could avoid. When the breakthrough finally arrived, it did not simply create a successful product. It rewrote the rules of the entire industry. The launch of the iPhone instantly exposed how outdated much of the mobile market had become. Consumers who had spent years navigating tiny keyboards, complicated menus, and limited internet access suddenly saw a completely different vision of the future. The device was not perfect. It lacked features that competitors immediately criticized. But those criticisms missed the larger point. Apple had changed the conversation. The smartphone was no longer just a communication tool. It had become a personal computer that fit in a pocket. The effect on the industry was immediate. Companies that had dominated for years found themselves reacting rather than leading. Nokia remained focused on protecting its existing business. BlackBerry continued to believe physical keyboards would remain essential for professionals. Motorola struggled to establish a clear direction. As consumers embraced touchscreens and app-based experiences, former giants discovered that past success offered little protection against technological change. Apple moved quickly to strengthen its position. The introduction of the App Store transformed the iPhone from a device into a platform. Developers suddenly had direct access to millions of users. New applications appeared for communication, entertainment, productivity, transportation, shopping, and countless other activities. Every successful app made the iPhone more valuable. Every new user attracted more developers. The ecosystem began feeding itself. What Apple created was difficult to replicate because it was not based on hardware alone. The company controlled the software, the design, the services, and the user experience. Each product became part of a larger environment that encouraged customers to remain inside the Apple ecosystem. Loyalty grew rapidly. Consumers were no longer simply buying phones. They were buying access to an entire digital lifestyle. Yet while Apple was capturing headlines, Samsung was executing a different strategy.
The South Korean giant understood something many competitors did not. The smartphone revolution would not belong exclusively to one company. The market was simply too large. Billions of people around the world would eventually adopt smartphones, and their needs, budgets, and preferences would vary dramatically. This realization aligned perfectly with Samsung's greatest strength. Instead of focusing on a single flagship product, Samsung launched devices across multiple price categories and markets. It embraced Google's Android operating system and used its manufacturing expertise to scale at extraordinary speed. While Apple maintained tight control over a relatively limited product lineup, Samsung flooded the market with options. The strategy worked. Galaxy smartphones began gaining traction around the world. Each generation improved design, performance, display technology, and camera quality. Samsung's ability to produce critical components internally gave it advantages that many competitors could not match. The company was not merely assembling phones. It was manufacturing many of the technologies that powered them. As smartphone adoption accelerated globally, Samsung expanded into emerging markets with remarkable effectiveness. Consumers who could not afford premium devices still had access to Samsung products. The company built a presence across every segment of the market while continuing to challenge Apple at the high end. Soon, the battle was no longer about innovation alone. It became a fight for scale. Quarter after quarter, smartphone sales surged. Apple generated enormous profits from premium devices and an increasingly loyal customer base. Samsung responded with volume, distribution, and relentless expansion. Both companies grew stronger as competitors weakened. The casualties were significant. Nokia's dominance faded. BlackBerry's influence collapsed. Former industry leaders that once seemed invincible struggled to remain relevant. The smartphone market was consolidating around a new reality. Consumers increasingly compared every device against either the iPhone or the latest Galaxy model. Other manufacturers still existed, but the center of gravity had shifted. By the beginning of the next decade, Apple and Samsung stood above nearly everyone else. Their rivalry was visible everywhere. Product launches became global events. New devices generated massive media coverage. Consumers debated operating systems with the intensity normally reserved for sports teams or political movements. Entire communities formed around brand loyalty. Some users viewed Apple as the standard for design and integration. Others saw Samsung as the symbol of innovation, flexibility, and technological ambition. The numbers reflected the scale of their success. Hundreds of millions of smartphones were being sold every year. Revenues reached levels once unimaginable in consumer electronics. Supply chains stretched across continents. Factories operated at enormous scale. Investors, competitors, regulators, and governments all watched closely because the outcome affected far more than the smartphone market. What had started as an emerging opportunity was becoming one of the most valuable industries on Earth. And at the center of it stood two companies that had transformed themselves into technology empires. The problem was that both now wanted the same thing. Neither intended to settle for second place. Success had turned Apple and Samsung into giants, but it had also created a new problem. The higher they climbed, the harder it became to stay ahead. Innovation had built their empires. Now they faced the challenge of protecting them. What made the situation unusual was that the two companies were fighting on multiple fronts at the same time. They competed for customers, developers, investors, media attention, and technological leadership. Yet beneath that competition remained an uncomfortable reality. Samsung was still deeply involved in the supply chain that helped produce Apple products. One of Apple's biggest rivals was also one of its most important partners. The relationship was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. As Galaxy devices gained popularity, Apple executives began seeing Samsung not as a supplier that happened to make smartphones, but as the most serious threat to the iPhone's future. Samsung, meanwhile, viewed Apple's dominance as a challenge that demanded an aggressive response. Neither company believed it could afford to slow down. The conflict soon moved beyond product launches and marketing campaigns. It entered courtrooms. patent lawsuits erupted across multiple countries. Apple argued that Samsung had copied critical aspects of the iPhone's design and user experience. Samsung responded with its own claims involving wireless technologies and intellectual property. What followed became one of the largest legal battles in the history of the technology industry. The lawsuits were about money, but they were also about identity. Apple had built its reputation on the idea that innovation deserved protection. From its perspective, allowing competitors to imitate key elements of its products threatened the very foundation of its business. Samsung viewed the situation differently. The smartphone industry depended on thousands of overlapping technologies developed by countless companies. No single organization could claim ownership over the future of mobile computing. Years of legal warfare followed. Court victories were celebrated, defeats were appealed, headlines generated billions of dollars in publicity. Yet despite the intensity of the conflict, the lawsuits failed to deliver a decisive victory for either side. Consumers continued buying smartphones, new models continued arriving, the market kept expanding. And that was where the first real warning signs began to emerge. While Apple and Samsung focused enormous resources on battling each other, the broader technology landscape continued evolving. The smartphone market that had once felt limitless was gradually changing. In developed countries, adoption rates were reaching maturity. Growth was slowing. Convincing someone to buy their first smartphone was easy compared to convincing them to replace a perfectly functional one. The rules that had fueled explosive expansion were beginning to shift. At the same time, competition intensified from unexpected directions. Chinese manufacturers entered the market with increasing confidence. Companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and others learned how to produce capable smartphones at prices that challenged traditional assumptions about profitability. Their devices improved rapidly. Features once considered premium became widely available. For Samsung, this created a difficult balancing act. The company had built much of its success on scale. It offered products across nearly every price category. That strategy helped Samsung dominate global shipments, but it also exposed the company to intense pressure from lower-cost competitors. Maintaining leadership required constant investment, faster product cycles, and increasingly complex operations. For Apple, the challenge looked different. The company remained exceptionally profitable, but its reliance on premium pricing created its own risks. Every new iPhone faced enormous expectations. Consumers expected meaningful innovation with each release. Investors expected continued growth. The market expected Apple to keep defining the future. Meeting those expectations year after year became increasingly difficult. Neither problem resulted from poor leadership. In fact, many of the decisions both companies made appeared logical at the time. Samsung expanded because expansion had fueled its rise. Apple protected its ecosystem because control had created its success. Each company doubled down on the strategies that had made them powerful. Yet success can create blind spots. When a strategy works repeatedly, questioning it becomes harder. The smartphone itself was also changing. During the industry's early years, every new generation introduced dramatic improvements. Screens became larger, processors became faster, cameras became significantly better. Entire categories of functionality appeared almost overnight. But eventually, progress became more incremental. New devices were still impressive, yet fewer consumers felt compelled to upgrade immediately. The revolutionary era was gradually giving way to a mature industry, and with maturity came a new challenge neither company could solve through hardware alone. The next battlefield was shifting toward ecosystems, services, subscriptions, cloud platforms, artificial intelligence, and long-term customer retention. Owning the device remained important, but controlling the digital experience surrounding the device was becoming even more valuable. The turning point was subtle enough that many observers missed it. The rivalry between Apple and Samsung had started as a contest over smartphones. But the future was no longer centered exclusively on smartphones. The device that had created their empires was slowly becoming just one piece of a much larger technological ecosystem. For years, both companies had focused on defeating each other. Now they faced a more complicated reality. The market that made them giants was changing beneath their feet, and the next phase of the war would determine not only who sold the most phones, but who controlled the future of personal technology itself. The next phase of the story did not produce a clear winner. That was perhaps the most surprising outcome of all. For years, analysts, investors, and consumers treated the rivalry as if it were a contest that would eventually end with one company standing above the other. Yet the smartphone industry proved more complicated than that. Apple never eliminated Samsung. Samsung never displaced Apple. Instead, both companies survived the most intense period of competition and emerged as dominant forces in a market they had helped create. But survival came with a cost. The smartphone business that once delivered explosive growth began behaving like a mature industry. Sales cycles lengthened. Consumers kept devices longer. Hardware improvements remained impressive, but fewer upgrades felt revolutionary. The days when a single product launch could fundamentally change the direction of the market became increasingly rare. As growth slowed, the definition of success changed. Samsung continued shipping enormous volumes of devices across the globe, maintaining a presence in virtually every major market. Apple focused on something different. Rather than chasing market share alone, it expanded deeper into services, software, subscriptions, and ecosystem integration. The iPhone remained central to Apple's strategy, but it became part of a larger network of products and digital experiences designed to keep customers engaged for years. The battle that once centered on phones gradually shifted toward ecosystems. Smartwatches, tablets, wireless earbuds, cloud services, payment platforms, health technologies, artificial intelligence, and connected devices became new fronts in the competition. The smartphone remained the gateway, but the real objective was no longer selling a single product. The objective was becoming indispensable to a customer's daily life. Meanwhile, the rest of the industry adapted to the world Apple and Samsung had created. Former leaders never fully recovered. Nokia's dominance became a case study in how quickly technological leadership can disappear. BlackBerry transformed from an industry giant into a cautionary tale. Motorola changed hands multiple times. The companies that once defined mobile technology found themselves overshadowed by a new generation of competitors. At the same time, ambitious manufacturers from China gained influence, forcing the entire industry to evolve faster and operate more efficiently. Competition became global, innovation accelerated, margins tightened. The market grew more crowded, more complex, and far less forgiving. Ironically, many of the technologies consumers now take for granted emerged because of the pressure Apple and Samsung placed on each other. Better cameras, faster processors, more advanced displays, stronger mobile ecosystems, improved battery performance. Entire categories of mobile software and services developed in an environment where standing still was not an option. Every breakthrough by one company forced a response from the other. The rivalry became a powerful engine for innovation. In the end, neither empire collapsed, but both learned the same lesson. Power in technology is temporary. No company remains untouchable forever. Market leadership creates confidence, but it can also create complacency. Innovation creates opportunity, but it also invites competition. The products that dominate one decade often become ordinary in the next. The companies that shape the future are rarely the ones protecting the past. What makes the Apple and Samsung story remarkable is not that one company defeated the other. It is that both survived a conflict intense enough to destroy many of their rivals, while simultaneously transforming an entire industry. Their war changed how billions of people communicate, work, shop, travel, learn, and interact with the world. It reshaped global supply chains, redefined consumer expectations, and turned the smartphone into one of the most important products ever created. And perhaps that is the real lesson. Technology empires are not built by avoiding competition. They are built by surviving it. The companies that endure are not always the fastest, the biggest, or even the most innovative. Often, they're the ones that recognize change before everyone else and adapt before it is too late. Because in the technology industry, every empire is only one disruption away from becoming history. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more of the battles, breakthroughs, and turning points that shaped the modern world, subscribe to Inside Tech Empires and join us for the next chapter.